Hey folks, welcome back for another episode of Code Club. In this episode, I am going to be critiquing this visualization from the Pew Research Center. If we've never met before, my name is Pat Schloss. I am a professor at the University of Michigan, and I'm really interested in data visualization and helping people to make better data visualizations, both through critique as well as by developing their R skills to implement good design in data visualization. So as I mentioned, this figure was sent to me by a viewer, like someone like you. So if you see something cool, feel free to send it my way. But this was published by the Pew Research Center. And what I'd like to do with you today is go through and do a systematic, structured critique of this visualization. I think it's pretty compelling, and as an old man, I think, oh my goodness, if we're getting news from TikTok, that sounds wretched. So anyway, I won't editorialize any further than that, than to perhaps give my insight into what I think works and doesn't work in this data visualization. So as we've been doing in the last few critiques that I've been posting, I have a structure that has the acronym of DAIJ. I wish that spelled something. Maybe I could come up with a better acronym, but the D is for description, A, analysis, I, interpretation, and then J, judgment. So this figure comes to us, again, like I said, from the Pew Research Center in an article that was published September 25th, 2025. I'm recording this at the end of October, and so it's about a month ago, and the title was 1 in 5 Americans now regularly get news on TikTok, up sharply from 2020. Again, it's just odd. What a world we live in. And this is an article written by Emily Tomasic and Katarina Eva Matza. Sorry for pronunciation. I'm a Midwesterner and we say things all kinds of weird. All right. And so in the article they go through and they have like this description of media consumption, social media consumption, and how people are using social media to get news. This is part of Pew's overall series of articles on media, how we get news, how we use media, what we trust, what we don't trust. They break it down by age and I believe race and gender. But this focuses a little bit on age, but mostly on social media and where people are getting news on social media. So what is the Pew Research Center? They're a think tank. Actually, I think they call themselves a fact tank. Let me see if I can find an about. So about Pew Research Center. Pew Research Center is a nonpartisan, non-advocacy fact tank that informs the public about the issues, attitudes, trends shaping the world. Does not take policy positions. The center conducts policy, opinion polling, demographic research, computational social science research, and other data-driven research. Okay, so it's part of the Pew Charitable Trusts. And so that is who Pew is. So we might think about like, who is the audience for Pew? Who are they writing this article for, right? People looking for data visualizations like myself. But I think they're trying to get after thinking about other social science think tanks, right? They're trying to provide information to other think tanks to get them information. And so I think they're going at perhaps a higher caliber of audience, kind of analytically, right? So if you're going to put a plot or two plots into an article, then you're kind of going after an audience, I think, that has a higher level of education than your typical local news consumer. I suspect they're primarily going to be a US-based audience because a lot of their content is focused on the United States. And then I think there is a bit of an audience that they're going after in kind of the general news, right? So this goes out as kind of a press release, right? And so if I go ahead and copy this and paste it into Google, and then I click on the news tab here, let's make this a little bit bigger, you'll see that there's a variety of other news venues like Fast Company, the Express Tribune, Washington Post, maybe. I think this was perhaps one of their previous articles that got caught. And so there's a variety of other news outlets out there picking this up. Of course, a lot of this is Pew getting hit by Google. But I think they do have a goal of putting out flashy headlines like this to get the media's attention, to then get the media to consume what they're offering. So as I mentioned earlier, this is part of a series of analyses that they have been putting out starting in the summer and now coming into the fall, talking about news and media consumption, not just on social media, but also in traditional media in the United States, and I think internationally as well. The media has become one of those institutions where trust in the media has really begun to decline. And so we saw this at the beginning of the first Trump administration. I'm sure we saw it before then, where someone called something that was objectively true fake news, right? So that phrase of fake news for real news started getting used, and then fake news for actually fake news also got to be used, right? And so if we're calling news fake news and we're not trusting what's legit, then we're certainly going to have a lack of trust in the media. And so I think that's like my initial thought, like to this headline of like people relying on TikTok. Anybody can put something on TikTok, which is great. But at the same time, there's no validation that what they're saying is true, right? And so maybe if it's like a citizen reporter showing you something live, that's something. But if it's someone else giving you the analysis and interpretation, then I don't know, at least to me, that's a bit worrisome and a bit different than what we're used to with the traditional media. And of course, there's all sorts of concern that the traditional media might be partisan or kind of in the bag of one political party or another, or one special interest or another. So the point, of course, is that this is a long-standing problem of where do we get our news from and who do we trust to give us that news? Okay, so if we think about now analysis, we want to consider the overall forum that the visual is being portrayed and what else is being presented alongside that visualization. And so if we scroll down, this is a rather short article from Pew. And so you'll see that there is a plot that's a series of, it's a faceted bar plot showing the percentage of adults, or I guess adults in this case, broken down by all adults versus different age groupings of adults and where they get their news from, right? And so this is regularly get news from TikTok by age group, right? And so this is across all age groups, all Americans, whether or not they actually use TikTok, right? So like 65 plus, very few of them get their news from TikTok, whereas 18 to 29, far more than the average, which is US adults, get their news from TikTok. And so the headline is 1 in 5, that's 20% of Americans, and that's what we see here. 2025, 20%, 1 in 5 get their news from TikTok. So if you scroll down, you then get to the plot that I'm interested in discussing for this critique, where it's more than half of US adult TikTok users get their news there, up from 22% in 2020. And so this isn't saying all Americans, this is only saying Americans who use TikTok, which percentage of TikTok users get their news from TikTok, right? And so instead of watching just cat videos on TikTok or stupid dance routines on TikTok, these are people who are also getting their news from TikTok. So more than half of TikTok users then are getting their news from TikTok. Trying to keep at a high level of the article, they do have a block in all of the articles that I've noticed at Pew called How We Do This. And so if we click on that, they then tell you about their panel and how they do this. They have a American Trends Panel, ATP, where they randomly recruit these people using residential addresses among people who have agreed to take surveys regularly, right? So this is automatically then going to impose a bias because I'm not going to take a survey because I'm sick of surveys, right? There's a lot of survey fatigue out there. And so not everybody's going to sign up for this, right? This would be kind of like saying, we're going to do a poll of people who have a landline phone, but like nobody has a landline phone anymore, right? And so you're going to get a very skewed distribution. And so I'm sure you can read more about their methodology in here and how they do all this stuff to weigh their data so that it is more representative and less biased by their sampling procedure. And so they talked about that the center regularly studies platforms and social media sites. This is part of their continued work, as I said, of measuring news consumption online. And so if I kind of click on these links, you can see I've already done that. That opens up a variety of fact sheets. And so this shows news consumption across all platforms, not just social media, but traditional news, newspapers, things like that. This second fact sheet is social media, right? And so percent who get their social media, the news from social media, probably me, like 30% of the people don't get their news from social media, and then others are rarely, sometimes, and often, right? And then we see data that is percent of US adults. So this is kind of like that first bar plot we saw, but looking at the 2025, right? And so, and then I guess that bar plot was just for TikTok, right? And so then the plot that we have, that we're thinking about, is kind of like this plot, right? Where it's looking over time at these 12 different social media sites. And I think if I zoom out, it changes the faceting as I zoomed out, right? And so this is much more like what we have back here in this plot, but this is perhaps a little bit more styled. One other thing that I had noticed is that we can actually get the data through this link for detailed tables. So that's cool. I hadn't seen that before. I started digging around looking for more information about the data actually. All right, so let's come back to this. We were talking about how we did this and that we can see how they did that from this box. Another question we might ask is, how are they making these plots, right? Like, these look very different to me than what I'm typically used to seeing, say, in R, right? And so I wonder, are they using Flourish? Are they using Tableau? Are they using Data Wrapper, right? And so if we do a Google search, let's see. The very first hit, what we learned from creating a custom graphics package. So this is from October 4, 2022. And it looks like, at least back then, I don't know if this is still the case, they made a custom graphics package in R using ggplot2. So their data visualizations are using ggplot2 with tidyverse to add their own styling to make things look like Pew, right? And so they've got a Pew plots package that looks more like this. Again, this should look very similar to what we are seeing, right? Where they've got points on lines with text annotation on those lines, right? That's very much like what we're seeing here, okay? And so it does appear that they're using R, which is cool. I think adds some legitimacy, as if we needed more legitimacy, that R is a good tool to use for data journalism. So in this particular visualization, there's a variety of labels. So they've got a title, a subtitle, and a caption. The title, I would say, is declarative. They are telling me what they want me to see in this plot. More than half of US adult TikTok users get news there, up from 22% in 2020, okay? They want me to focus on TikTok. And if that wasn't obvious already, TikTok is bolded in this facet, and it has this like light brown, kind of grayish background to make it pop out compared to all of the other social media platforms, okay? And so the title tells me what they want me to see, right? The subtitle then is descriptive, right? The percent of each social media site's users who regularly get news there, okay? And so this was kind of like the y-axis. So I'm starting to notice a bit of a trend when I look at data visualizations put out by the news media. They do not like y-axis labels, right? Or even y-axes, as we see. And they tend to put them as a subtitle. I think that is like a more common trend. They also then tend to put the numbers on the points, which, again, that's not how we do things in scientific literature, but it's interesting to see what they think does the best job of communicating information. All right, so then they have a caption that tells a little bit more about how they generated the data, right? So note, the other response option was no, don't regularly get news on this. And so they say only respondents who indicated that they use each site were asked if they regularly get news on it, okay? So if I don't use TikTok, I don't show up in here, right? That's the other poll, right? That's the all US citizens or all Americans, right? Also, they then tell us that social media sites are shown left to right in descending order by the share of US adults who regularly get their news there. As I think we saw, where to go here, right? It's this first plot that they are using to order the panels, right? And so you can see that 38% of people in the US get their news or get news off of Facebook, off YouTube, Instagram, and so forth, right? You see it declining as we go from left to right. And these add up to more than 100 because people might be on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, and get news from all these different sites. And so it's going to add up to more than 100. We then also see the source, survey of US adults conducted August 18 to 24, 2025, right? So again, this is the context of when the poll was conducted, how it was conducted, and then a bit about how the data are being presented. So if we again put our ggplot2 hat on and we think about aesthetics, think about what's getting mapped to the axes, to the lines and colors and all sorts of things. Well, on the x-axis, we have the year, right? And so they have data going back to 2020 up to 2025. Of course, for some things like blue sky, they don't have data back before 2025, right? Because perhaps it didn't exist or it was just so small that no one knew anything about it. On the y-axis, it's the percent of each social media site's users who regularly get their news there, right? So it's the percentage of TikTok users who get news on TikTok. We then have a grouping variable to connect the points, and we connect the points by the social media platform. Also, then we're faceting the data by the social media platform, right? So we're grouping it and faceting it by the platform. The color of the lines and the points doesn't vary by anything. It's the same color in all of the lines, right? So it's this kind of maroon color for the line. Also, the points have a maroon border and a white fill. This is my favorite plotting symbol as I talk about symbol 21 if you're using ggplot2, where you can set the interior color to be different than the exterior color. There's also a text geom that I would say they're using, or I guess if they're using R, then they're using a text geom. To label the first and last points of each of the lines, right? And so using like geom text to do that, where the label is the same as the y-axis position. I don't see anything special in the annotations. I mean, they've got the title for their different facets here. One bit of annotation that we might consider is that they've got this dotted line separating each of the different facets. They're not using a box, they're using these dotted vertical lines to separate each facet panel. So cool. All right. So that's analysis. We've done the description, the analysis, and now we want to turn to interpretation, where we want to think about whether or not what do we think based on this plot? Do we think the title is supported by the data or not? And then what other things do we think about? So first of all, I think the data support the title. More than half of US adult TikTok users get news there, up from 22% in 2020, right? So again, TikTok right here, more than half are getting their news there. And then back in 2020, it was 22%, right? So that's what we see, okay? So the title, I think, is supported by the data, and the visualization pretty clearly shows us that. Now, I think every good data visualization is going to then cause you to ask many other questions. And so when I ask these questions, I hope it doesn't come off as me criticizing the plot. I think it's hopefully me, praising the plot, right? If I'm coming up with additional questions, then that's cool, right? Because the plot's got me thinking. And so one question that comes to mind is that it's clear that TikTok is rising faster than all the other platforms. But I noticed that all the platforms kind of tap out between like, say, 55 and 60%, right? There's nothing much higher than that. And so I wonder if there's maybe a ceiling on what these platforms can expect to get for news consumption, right? And so, I mean, we don't have the data, right? So we'll have to see as we go out in time how that changes. So it seems clear to me that Reddit is in decline. I don't know what its overall market share is doing, but the percentage of people getting news that use Reddit from Reddit seems to be falling off. And so I wonder if that's kind of like a broader trend that people are seeing in Reddit. And also WhatsApp, very few people on the whole get their news from WhatsApp. And so part of me wonders, like with something like WhatsApp, which I think is more of like a text messaging tool rather than like a news dissemination or a kind of broader communication tool like that, is whether or not the platforms are set up for news, right? So how would a news venue or news influencer, if you will, communicate news on WhatsApp, right? And at the same time, I'm kind of surprised that YouTube isn't killing this, right? Because I would think that if you're a local news, traditional local news venue, then you would be all over YouTube, right? Because you could post your videos like I do here, right? And similarly for Facebook and Instagram, right? And so I wonder what kind of the news content, like how much news content is there on these different venues, and how does that relate to whether or not people are actually getting their news from that venue? So for example, like Blue Sky, is quite low because there's not a lot of people on Blue Sky and there's not a lot of news venues on Blue Sky, right? I don't know that like ESPN or CNN or ABC are on Blue Sky and doing a whole lot there. I know that like government agencies have just finally gotten on to Blue Sky, right? And so, again, if there's not a lot there, then people aren't going to be consuming a lot of news from there. So that's my interpretation of the plot and kind of what it makes me think. Now let's think about judgment. And again, just because I judge something doesn't mean that I'm being harsh to it or I'm giving a negative perspective on it. The kind of feedback I would give to these authors who made this plot is very much like what I would give somebody working in my lab. A lot of what if questions, because I have questions that came up during that interpretation phase. And I would want to see the data perhaps in a different way to help kind of tease out some of those questions that I started to ask. And it's very likely that these authors have also thought about those questions, tried them, and they didn't work, right? But anyway, maybe not. Maybe I've got some novel ideas that they could try. So again, I think the plot does what it's supposed to do. It did take me a bit to get there. So again, thinking about the context of the article, we have two plots, right? We have this bar plot showing TikTok usage and I guess where people are getting news by age. And then we have TikTok users and whether or not they're getting news from TikTok. So I saw this plot and thought, more than half of US adults get their news from TikTok, right? I mentally transposed it because that's what I was looking for, right? Again, the title of the article was that 1 in 5 Americans now get their news on TikTok, which I was then confused because, well, that's 55%. That's not 1 in 5. And then I had to dig in to say, oh, wait, this is TikTok users, not all US consumers. And so I'm left wondering then, like, how many TikTok users are there relative to, say, Facebook or YouTube or Instagram users, right? I have to think TikTok is still quite small relative to Facebook. And if we go back to the social media and news fact sheet, we can see that like 38% Facebook, 35 YouTube, 20 Instagram, 20 TikTok, right? But that still doesn't tell me like total number of Facebook users. Like what is Facebook's market share relative to say TikTok or Reddit or some of these other platforms, right? So I would like that context. Again, I'm always looking for bigger, greater context to understand what's going on. I was also a bit confused when I was looking at this, why TikTok was here in fourth when TikTok is the focus of the article. Why wasn't TikTok first, right? And so it wasn't until I dug into the caption here to see that the social media sites are shown left to right in descending order by the share of US adults who regularly get their news from there, right? But it's not even by market share, right? And so it'd be interesting, again, to do it by market share to get, I think, that broader context. And so I think something that would help get at that market share or at perhaps the overall media consumption on each site would be to like underneath each of these labels to put in parentheses then the percentage of users of Facebook in 2025 that got their media, their news from Facebook, right? And so then put that underneath those titles. So then I might reorganize these columns by the percentage of users who get their media from that site, right? And so maybe you would start out with X, Twitter, TikTok, Truth Social, and then, the rest in whatever order, right? One concern I would have though is that this is already a bit cluttered, I feel, right? There's a lot of information here. There's 12 different sites here. And so if we put more information under the names, that just might make it harder to read. So I would appreciate that's a limitation, but it would be something I would like to see. One other thing that could perhaps alleviate some of that clutter is getting rid of the numbers at the ends of each of these lines and put a y-axis up. That's the scientist in me. I want to see that y-axis because I don't know that I really care about 55 versus 57%, right? I care that like, wow, TikTok really grew a lot, right? And that these numbers are all pretty similar. But like, between 53 and 59% for the sampling size and sampling error that they have, I feel like by putting those numbers at the ends of the lines, they're giving a kind of false sense of precision in the data. And so, I don't know, I would be cool with removing that text and putting a y-axis. I think the other thing that adds clutter to this are those points at the ends or kind of inside the lines, right? I think the line with overlaid points just makes it kind of cluttered. I realize that's the Pew style, but I would tell them to get a new style. I don't know. And perhaps for some of these things like threads and blue sky, where there's only one data point, maybe we don't need to include them because they are so rare. You could put in the caption, like, nobody uses these platforms. Why do you care, right? I don't know. I do commend them for using these 12 different social media platforms. I do wonder, though, like, where's LinkedIn? Where's Mastodon? And maybe LinkedIn people think is perhaps too professional, that people aren't getting news there, but I suspect people are getting their business news there, right? And Mastodon is probably further to the right than Blue Sky. Even fewer people using that than, say, Blue Sky. So I don't know, but those are kind of questions or things that I would like to see at least tried. And maybe if we've got too many platforms on here, then we could limit it to like the top 5 platforms. And so really what I wanted to see when I looked at this plot was a single x-axis, a single y-axis, and then 5 lines, right? Or 12 lines in this case, right? To kind of see how did the lines compare to each other? But I realized that 12 lines is going to be a horrible jumbled mess, kind of like the last video we saw where we had 30 years worth of data all lined up on top of each other. But here, I get the need to pull that apart, right? Like it's a limitation that we've got a lot of platforms we want to compare. And so having a plot with 12 lines is going to be a hot mess. And so that might be a good reason then to go to, I don't know, a smaller number of platforms, the most common platforms, these, I suspect from next door off to the right, these don't have a lot of market share. And so I would be cool with just cutting them, but what do I know? But then someone's going to ask, well, what about Blue Sky? What about Rumble? What about all these other things? So I get it. That's again, a limitation, and that we can't make the perfect plot that answers all of the questions. I think for what they're trying to do and give a pretty broad overview while also focusing on TikTok, I think they've done a pretty good job. There are things I would do to perhaps try to clean it up a bit, but I also respect that this is part of the Pew Research Center's overall style guide and how they do things. I would just perhaps encourage them to maybe change their style guide. Who knows? Anyway, that's all I'm going to say for today on this plot. In the next episode, I will be trying to recreate this plot as a live stream using ggplot2, and I'll do my own styling. I won't be using Pew's special data visualization package. So I encourage you to subscribe to the channel so you know when that live stream is posted, and tell your friends what we're doing, because the more the merrier, and I would love to help more people learn to make more effective data visualizations. Until next time, keep practicing, and we'll see you for another episode of Code Club.